the code for Noteherder. Looks like we've got Font Awesome and we've got Bootstrap for layout. We used Foundation before, right? Bootstrap's kind of like Foundation. The truth is this is mostly custom CSS, but we got just a little bit out of Bootstrap to make a few things easier. Bootstrap's a lot like Foundation, though. And they have really good documentation. So it looks like app imports a style sheet. Surprise, surprise. We do some Firebase stuff, so we have a file just like we did in the other one. I should note that because this was written a couple weeks ago, this uses the older version of Rebase. I haven't rewritten it with the new one yet. It still works fine, but it's a little different than the solution in the other one. You can see which version it is and force it to be the version you want inside what file? File if I have a dependency and I want to, what's that? Yeah, right, package.json. And we haven't done a lot of editing this file directly. It gets edited when we run things like npm install save dev or yarn add, right? So we see Rebase, and when I installed it, it was at version 2.7.0 instead of 3.0. So that'll keep working. If you pull this code down and run yarn install or npm install, you'll still get a version that's going to work with the code I've written here. So you don't have to worry about that breaking. Okay, we've got a sign-in component we import, and we've got a main component that we import. And then besides that, we just import this public route and private route that I mentioned earlier. So let's look at app. Okay, I didn't use the property initializer. I used the constructor to initialize my state. When you do that, you need to make sure you call super, as we learned early on. And we initialize state, UID is null, notes, an empty array. So in thing list, I think, did we make it an object in thing list? We made it an array in meganote and an object in thing list, but we use an array here. Component will mount. A lifecycle hook, right? And in case these lifecycle hooks are confusing, here's one little bit I'll clear up in case you're not catching on. Like, did we just make up the name component will mount? Because we just wrote this method out of nothing, right? But we're implementing something that's defined in the superclass, right, in the parent class. Because this is actually a class that inherits from React component, right? So, no, we didn't make it up. It's something that's defined in React component. And if that method is there, it will call that at a certain point in the component's life cycle, not lifestyle. Oh, ooh. It calls get user from local storage. So we've been storing the user in state, but this actually stores it in local storage. So you will get the user ID more or less immediately before you've had a time to talk to Firebase. So that prevents it from sort of being signed out until it has done that. It will treat you as signed in from the moment it loads it from local storage. So we do that right away before the page renders. Because component will mount happens just before things get added to the DOM. So here's how get user from local storage works. If you're tempted to think, well, gosh, yeah, we learned about local storage, but we didn't learn how to use it with React, it doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with React. We've used local storage. Local storage works the same way in the context of React as it does anywhere else. So you just use local storage get item, just like we did before. And then I happen to set state with what I got out of it. But it's not that different. Then we have an auth handler callback, like we did the other time. This, instead of calling it signed in, I called it authed. That returns true or false, whether there's an ID in state. We have a sign out method that does what you would expect. We have setup notes. I think we had something like this for things. Maybe. Let's see. So if not this.state.uid return. So who can summarize what this line in English is doing? Yeah.
If the user is not logged in, then you can't really set up notes for a user that doesn't
Yeah. So if they're not logged in, if there's no ID, just get the heck out of here. Don't continue. Then we call the Firebase sync state. Save note. Looks like we create a timestamp just like we did with thing list. Now, this thing does get a little tricky, so check this out. Let's create a brand new note. The URL is just /notes now. As soon as I start typing, because it saves as we type, I've got a new note, right? So watch the URL when I do that. I have less than 3 React. So the URL updated with the ID of the thing we just created as soon as we saved it. So the way we wrote save note, okay, we get a timestamp, which, as you might guess, we're using to set the ID, right? And then I set a variable should redirect to false. If not note.id. So what am I really checking there? Anybody besides Steve? I will call on you if no one else volunteers. Yeah, Steve.
If the node doesn't have an ID, so basically if the node doesn't exist.
Right. If this has never been saved before. If it's never been saved before, then I need to set the ID, right, to that timestamp. And if I'm saving it for the first time, I should redirect at the end of this whole process, right? I should go from /notes to /notes/ whatever the ID ends up being. Understand? Makes sense now that you hear it? And a lot of times we make very, very short methods that do only one thing. And we're big fans and proponents of doing so. And here's an example of where maybe that would be helpful. If you didn't get that that's what this was about, you could write another method called note exists. That takes a note as an argument. And it just returns note.id. Because if there's not one there, it'll be undefined, which is falsy. Or if you wanted to be sure that it returned a Boolean, because this would work. Because if you say if and then some big number, that's true. And if you say if undefined, that's false. So that would be adequate. But if you wanted, you could. How could we make this return a Boolean? What's one way that we can make sure that this returns actually true or false, not a string or undefined? Who can think of a trick for doing that? And one, we could and it with something that we know is true. Then it's a comparison. Then we may get a Boolean back. Were you thinking something, Evan?
Yeah. Could you do like if note.id return true, else return false?
Yeah, we could do that. That's, yeah, definitely. Or we could use a ternary to achieve the same thing with one line. I'll show you the shortcut that I like. Double negative. So if note ID is a truthy thing, putting not in front of that would return false. But we want it to return true. So using a double negative, it gets back to the same truthy value that it had before. But now it's definitely a Boolean. So throwing in a double negative like that is just a trick to always force something to be a Boolean. So then we could change this to, if not, this.note exists. And then maybe it's a little more obvious what this line is doing. Like this is such an uncomplicated method that it may feel like it's not even worth having there. But because we named the method something useful, when we call it, it's more obvious what it's for. Why is this line of code there? Because we need to check whether the note exists. We don't really care that much about the ID. So if it doesn't exist, we set the ID and we set this variable should redirect to true instead of false. Okay, and then it looks like Note has a field called updated that gets the timestamp. So even if we don't need to set the ID, we still use this timestamp that we created up here, because we want to keep track of when this was last updated, because we're sorting by that. Then we do what we did before. We get the note at that particular place. We set it to the note that we just changed or created, and then we set state. And that's the business of saving the note. And then if should redirect, this.props.history.push. Did you use history.push in the other thing? Okay. Then we push it to /notes/ the ID that we just set. Make sense? It's a lot of stuff at once, but individually we know how to do all of these things. We've done most of these things before in another context. Remove note. The difference between remove note and remove thing is we have routes now. So once again, when we delete this, we don't want it to stay at this ID that doesn't exist. We want it to go back to an empty note, so we go back to /notes. So we make sure to push that onto history. Then we have render. Renders, nothing we haven't dealt with before, except our routes are a little different.